Officer Dale Thompson's hands trembled as he stared at the federal badge in disbelief. Around him, 12 FBI agents had their weapons drawn, their voices cutting through the humid afternoon air like knives. "You have the right to remain silent," one of them barked. But Thompson couldn't hear anything over the pounding of his own heart. Just 30 minutes earlier, he thought he'd made the arrest of his career. Now, as he looked at the man he'd just planted drugs on, the reality hit him like a freight train. This wasn't some street dealer from the city. This was James Bennett, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Thompson had just destroyed his entire life in one moment of greed and corruption. But how did we get here? How did a routine traffic stop in sleepy Millbrook County turn into a federal case that would shake the foundations of an entire police department? The answer lies 48 hours earlier. On a quiet Sunday morning, when two men's paths crossed in the most devastating way possible. James Bennett adjusted his rearview mirror and let out a long sigh as he pulled away from Sunset Manor nursing home. The visit with his mother hadn't gone well. At 82, she was fighting a battle against dementia that seemed to steal a little more of her each week. Today, she hadn't recognized him at all. The woman who had sacrificed everything to put him through law school, who had worked double shifts at the diner just so he could afford his textbooks, looked at him like he was a stranger. Bennett was 55 years old, with graying hair at his temples and the kind of quiet dignity that came from decades of fighting for justice. Just 6 months ago, he had been sworn in as the director of the FBI, the culmination of a career that started in the public defender's office right here in Millbrook County. Few people knew that the man now responsible for federal law enforcement across the entire United States had grown up in the housing projects just 15 miles from where he now drove. He was wearing a simple polo shirt and khakis today, nothing that would indicate his position of power. His car was a modest Honda Accord, not the kind of vehicle you'd expect to see the head of the FBI driving. Bennett had always believed in staying humble, remembering where he came from. Today, that humility was about to put him in the most dangerous situation of his life. As he drove through the main street of Millbrook, Bennett couldn't help but notice how little had changed since his childhood. The same small shops lined the road, the same faded American flags hung from the streetlights. But something else hadn't changed either. Something much darker that Bennett knew all too well from his days as a young black man growing up in this town. Meanwhile, just 3 blocks away, Officer Dale Thompson was having the worst week of his life. At 38, he looked older than his years, with deep lines around his eyes and the kind of permanent scowl that came from too many sleepless nights. Thompson had been a cop in Millbrook for 12 years, but the job had never paid enough to support his real passion, gambling. Last Tuesday, he'd lost $8,000 at the Riverboat Casino. Money he didn't have. Money that belonged to some very dangerous people who didn't accept excuses. The loan sharks had given him until Friday to come up with the cash, plus interest. That gave him exactly 3 days to find $12,000 or face consequences he didn't want to think about. But Thompson had a plan. It wasn't legal and it wasn't ethical, but it was effective. For the past 6 months, he'd been supplementing his income through a partnership with some local drug dealers. They would pay him $500 for every arrest he made that resulted in seized drugs. The beauty of the arrangement was simple. Thompson didn't need to find real criminals. He just needed to find people who looked like they might be criminals. People who wouldn't be believed when they claimed their innocence. If you're watching this and wondering how a situation like this could happen in modern America, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to show you exactly how deep corruption can run in small-town police departments. Thompson had been driving around for hours that Sunday morning, looking for his next target. He needed at least 24 more arrests to make his debt, which meant planting evidence on 24 innocent people. The thought should have made him sick, but desperation had a way of killing conscience. That's when he spotted the Honda Accord, with out-of-state plates, driving exactly 35 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. The driver was a black man, well-dressed, driving alone. Thompson's racist assumptions kicked in immediately. In his mind, any black man driving through his town was either lost or up to no good. When he ran the license plate through the system and saw that it was registered to an address in an upscale neighborhood in Washington, D.C., Thompson's greed took over completely. "Rich black guy driving through my territory," Thompson muttered to himself as he flipped on his lights, "probably carrying cash from a drug deal. This is going to be my biggest payday yet." Bennett saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't run any red lights. He'd been driving like the law-abiding citizen he was. But Bennett knew that in small towns like Millbrook, being black and driving through the wrong neighborhood was sometimes crime enough. He pulled over carefully, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. Everything he did next could mean the difference between going home safely and becoming another statistic. Bennett had spent his entire career studying criminal justice, but right now, all that knowledge felt useless. Right now, he was just another black man at the mercy of a police officer who had already decided he was guilty of something. Thompson approached the car with his hand resting on his weapon, already formulating the lies he would put in his report. He had a small bag of cocaine in his back pocket, the same bag he'd used to frame 6 other innocent people this month. In his mind, this was just business. He had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. What would you do if you were pulled over by a corrupt cop who was planning to plant drugs on you? Let me know in the comments below, because James Bennett's response to this situation was about to change everything. Thompson's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached Bennett's driver's side window, his hand still resting on his service weapon. This was all theater to him now. A performance he'd rehearsed dozens of times before. The aggressive posture, the intimidating presence, the implicit threat of violence. It was designed to make his victims compliant, scared, and less likely to fight back when he planted evidence on them. "License and registration," Thompson barked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. But Bennett wasn't intimidated. He'd dealt with men like Thompson his entire career, bullies who used their badge as a weapon against people they thought couldn't fight back. "Certainly, officer," Bennett replied, his voice steady and professional. He reached slowly for his glove compartment, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. Most people he stopped were either terrified or angry by now. This man's calm composure was throwing him off his game. "You were speeding," he lied smoothly. "Radar clocked you at 42 and a 35. Bennett knew this was a lie. He'd been watching his speedometer carefully, driving exactly the speed limit like he always did. But challenging a lie from a police officer could escalate this situation beyond his control. "I don't believe I was speeding, officer, but I understand you have a job to do." That calm, educated response made Thompson even angrier. In his twisted worldview, black men were supposed to be either submissive or hostile, not articulate and composed. Bennett's dignity was threatening Thompson's entire narrative about who deserved respect and who didn't. "Step out of the vehicle," Thompson ordered, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "I need to conduct a search." Bennett's heart rate increased, but his expression remained neutral. This was the moment he'd been dreading. He knew his rights, knew that Thompson had no probable cause for a search, but he also knew that asserting those rights could get him killed. In this moment, the director of the FBI was just another black man who could become a statistic if he made the wrong move. "Officer, I don't consent to a search," Bennett said quietly, using the exact words he'd taught countless law students over the years. "But I won't resist if you insist on conducting one." Thompson smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Smart man. Now step out of the car and keep your hands where I can see them." As Bennett slowly exited his vehicle, Thompson was already calculating his next moves. The search would give him the opportunity to plant the cocaine. Then he'd discover it, make the arrest, and collect his $500 bonus. Simple, clean, profitable. But this wasn't just another routine frame-up for Thompson. As Bennett stood beside his car, something about the man's bearing, his quiet confidence, was making Thompson nervous. Most of his victims were young, scared, and had no idea how to handle themselves in this situation. Bennett was different. Bennett was dangerous in a way Thompson couldn't quite understand. "Place your hands on the hood," Thompson commanded, beginning his illegal search of the vehicle. As he went through the motions of checking the interior, his mind wandered to why this particular arrest felt so important. Maybe it was because he was running out of time to pay back his debt. Maybe it was because Bennett's calm defiance reminded him of someone else, someone from a long time ago who had made Thompson feel small and powerless. As Thompson moved to the trunk of the car, Bennett watched in the reflection of the rear window. He saw Thompson's hand move to his back pocket, saw him palm something small and dark. Bennett's blood ran cold. He was about to be framed, and there was nothing he could do to stop it without risking his life. Thompson popped the trunk and made a show of searching through Bennett's belongings: a small overnight bag, some paperwork, a bouquet of flowers he'd brought to his mother. Then, with practiced sleight of hand, Thompson slipped the small plastic bag containing cocaine behind the spare tire. Well, Thompson said loudly, his voice carrying across the empty road. "What do we have here?" Bennett watched in horror as Thompson pulled out the bag of drugs, holding it up like a trophy. The performance was designed to be witnessed by passing cars, by security cameras, by anyone who might later testify that the drugs were legitimately found during a search. "Sir, that's not mine," Bennett said, his voice still steady despite the rage building inside him. "You just planted that evidence." Thompson's face twisted into a mask of mock surprise. "Are you accusing me of planting evidence? That's a serious allegation, son. The kind of thing that could get you in even more trouble." But as Thompson looked at Bennett's face, something unexpected happened. Instead of fear or desperation, Bennett's expression showed something much more dangerous. Recognition. Not just recognition of what was happening, but recognition of Thompson himself. What Thompson didn't know was that this wasn't the first time James Bennett had been in this exact situation. 37 years earlier, in this same town, a 17-year-old James Bennett had been walking home from his job at the grocery store when Officer Frank Morrison decided he looked suspicious. Young Bennett had been wearing his work uniform, a white shirt and black pants that were required by his employer. But to Officer Morrison, a black teenager walking through a white neighborhood at night was automatically a criminal. Morrison had planted a bag of marijuana on teenage Bennett, arrested him, and destroyed what should have been a promising young man's future. But James Bennett was not a typical teenager. Even at 17, he was determined, brilliant, and absolutely refused to accept injustice. Instead of pleading guilty to avoid jail time like most of Morrison's victims did, Bennett fought back. He studied law in the public library, learned about evidence procedures, and eventually proved that Morrison had a pattern of planting evidence on minority suspects. The case made national news. Officer Frank Morrison was sent to prison for civil rights violations, and 17-year-old James Bennett decided that day that he would dedicate his life to fighting corruption in law enforcement. That injustice had forged him into the man who now stood as the director of the FBI. Looking at Thompson now, Bennett could see Morrison's face, could feel the same helpless rage he'd experienced as a teenager. But this time was different. This time, Bennett had resources, power, and the full weight of federal law enforcement behind him. Thompson, oblivious to the historical significance of this moment, was already mentally spending his bonus money. $500 would go to the loan sharks, leaving him only $11,500 short. He needed 23 more arrests like this one. 23 more innocent people whose lives he would destroy for money. What Bennett was witnessing wasn't an isolated incident of police misconduct. Over the past 6 months, Thompson had perfected his system of corruption. His first victim had been Carlos Mendez, a 19-year-old college student driving home from work at a restaurant. Thompson had planted methamphetamine in Carlos's backpack and arrested him for drug possession. Carlos lost his scholarship, dropped out of college, and spent 6 months in jail before accepting a plea deal. Then came Angela Williams, a single mother of 2, who worked as a nurse at the county hospital. Thompson planted cocaine in her purse during a traffic stop, claiming she'd been driving erratically. Angela lost her nursing license, her job, and nearly lost custody of her children. After Angela came David Kim, a small business owner who had been driving to make a bank deposit for his family's restaurant. Thompson planted heroin in David's briefcase and seized the $3,000 in cash as drug proceeds. David's restaurant closed within 2 months. The pattern was always the same. Thompson targeted minorities who were isolated, who wouldn't be believed when they claimed their innocence, who didn't have the resources to fight back effectively. He chose his victims carefully. People society would write off as expendable. But Thompson had made a critical error in his victim selection process this time. James Bennett was many things, but expendable wasn't one of them. While Bennett was remembering his past, Thompson was calculating his future. The gambling debts weren't just numbers on paper, they were a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The loan sharks he owed money to didn't negotiate payment plans or accept excuses. They collected their debts in full, or they collected body parts as interest. Thompson's gambling addiction had started innocently enough. A few dollars on football games with friends, then bigger bets at the Riverboat Casino. Soon he was borrowing money to chase losses, taking cash advances on credit cards, and eventually borrowing from people who broke kneecaps when payment was late. The corruption had started as desperation, but it had evolved into something much darker. Thompson had discovered that he enjoyed the power, the control, the way he could destroy someone's life with a simple planted bag of drugs. Each false arrest fed his ego as much as his bank account. Standing behind Bennett's car, Thompson felt that familiar rush of power. This well-dressed, articulate black man was about to become another victim, another success story in Thompson's war against people he thought didn't belong. "James Bennett," Thompson said, reading from the driver's license, "you are under arrest for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute." The irony of that moment was staggering. Thompson was arresting the one man in America who had more authority to investigate police corruption than anyone else in the country. But Thompson was so blinded by his own prejudices and desperation that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Thompson commanded, pulling out his handcuffs. Bennett complied without resistance, but his mind was already working. He was memorizing every detail. Thompson's badge number, his physical appearance, his exact words, the time of day, the weather conditions. All of it would be important later when Thompson found himself on the receiving end of a federal investigation. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Thompson felt a surge of triumph. This was his biggest caller in months. A well-dressed suspect with out-of-state plates, driving an expensive car, caught with enough cocaine to suggest dealing rather than personal use. The arrest would look great on his record and earn him serious money. "You have the right to remain silent," Thompson began, reciting the Miranda warning in a bored, mechanical voice. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Bennett listened to the familiar words with bitter irony. He'd heard these rights read countless times during his career, but never while wearing handcuffs himself. The injustice of the moment was almost overwhelming, but Bennett forced himself to stay focused. Getting emotional wouldn't help him now. What he needed was strategy. "Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" Thompson asked. "I understand them perfectly," Bennett replied, his voice carrying just a hint of something that should have warned Thompson he was making a terrible mistake. As Thompson loaded Bennett into the back of his patrol car, he was already composing the arrest report in his head. He would describe Bennett as nervous, evasive, possibly under the influence. He would claim Bennett gave consent for the search, then change his story when the drugs were found. He would paint Bennett as just another drug dealer who thought his expensive clothes and fancy car would protect him from justice. Thompson had no idea that he was about to become the subject of the largest federal investigation into police corruption in the state's history. At the Millbrook County Police Station, Thompson was in an excellent mood. The booking process had gone smoothly, and Bennett had remained cooperative throughout. Thompson had processed dozens of arrests exactly like this one, and they all followed the same pattern. Initial defiance, then resignation, then plea bargaining to avoid serious jail time. "All right, Bennett," Thompson said, settling into his chair at the booking desk. "You get one phone call. Make it count." This was Thompson's favorite part of the process. Watching his victims call family members, lawyers, or friends to tell them about their arrest was always satisfying. It was proof that Thompson held power over people's lives, that he could destroy relationships and reputations with a simple criminal charge. Most of his victims called their mothers, crying and apologizing. Some called lawyers they couldn't afford. A few called bail bondsmen who would put them deeper into debt. All of them called someone who would be disappointed, scared, and powerless to help them. Bennett nodded calmly and picked up the phone. He dialed a number from memory, a number that Thompson assumed belonged to some overpriced defense attorney who would take Bennett's money and then advise him to accept a plea deal. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Deputy Director Patterson's office." "This is Bennett," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to initiate Protocol 7 immediately. Location is Millbrook County Police Department. I'll need a full federal response team and call the Attorney General personally." Thompson was only half listening, filling out paperwork and thinking about how he would spend his bonus money. He caught fragments of the conversation, something about protocols and federal responses, but it sounded like legal jargon to him. Probably some expensive lawyer using big words to justify his fees. "Understood, sir," came the response through the phone. "ETA is 45 minutes. Should we coordinate with local authorities?" Bennett glanced at Thompson, who was still obliviously filling out his false report. "Negative. Treat this as a hostile jurisdiction until further notice. And Patterson? Make sure they understand this is priority 1. Thompson looked up from his paperwork, suddenly aware that this conversation didn't sound like a typical defendant calling for help. But before he could think too hard about it, Bennett had hung up the phone. "Lawyer's on his way," Bennett said simply, returning to his seat. Thompson nodded, satisfied that everything was proceeding according to plan. In his experience, the fancier the lawyer sounded, the faster they advised their clients to accept plea deals. This arrest would be wrapped up within a week. Bennett would be convicted of drug possession, and Thompson would collect his money. He had no idea that 45 minutes from now, his life would be over. Can you imagine being in James Bennett's position, framed by a corrupt cop who has no idea who he's messing with? What do you think happens when those federal agents arrive at the police station? Drop your predictions in the comments below. You won't believe what's coming next. Chief Maria Rodriguez had been running the Millbrook County Police Department for 8 years, and in all that time, she'd never quite known what to make of Officer Dale Thompson. On paper, he was one of her most productive officers. Consistently high arrest numbers, particularly for drug-related offenses. But something about his cases always felt slightly off to her experienced eye. When Thompson walked James Bennett into the station in handcuffs, Chief Rodriguez felt that familiar unease settle in her stomach. The suspect didn't look like Thompson's usual arrests. Bennett was well-dressed, articulate, and carried himself with a dignity that seemed inconsistent with being caught with drugs in his car. But Rodriguez had learned to trust her officer's judgment, even when her instincts told her otherwise. "What do we have, Thompson?" Rodriguez asked, looking up from her paperwork as they passed her office. "Cocaine possession with intent to distribute," Thompson replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. "Pulled him over for speeding, got consent for a search, found a substantial amount of product in the trunk." Rodriguez nodded, but something in Bennett's expression caught her attention. Most drug arrests involved suspects who were either belligerent, terrified, or completely strung out. Bennett looked none of those things. He looked like a man who was studying everything around him, memorizing details, planning his next move. "Run it by the book," Rodriguez told Thompson. "Full documentation, proper evidence handling. I don't want any procedural issues with this one." "Of course, Chief," Thompson replied, but Rodriguez caught a flash of something in his eyes, irritation, maybe even concern. Why would proper procedure worry an officer unless he had something to hide? As Thompson processed Bennett through booking, Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that this arrest was different. She'd been a cop for 23 years, and her instincts had kept her alive through 2 decades of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was very wrong with this picture. In the holding cell, Bennett sat quietly on the metal bench, his mind racing through possibilities and procedures. The Millbrook County Jail was exactly as he remembered it from his teenage years. The same cracked concrete walls, the same fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly, the same smell of disinfectant mixed with human desperation. But Bennett wasn't focused on nostalgia. He was conducting his own investigation from inside the cell. Over the past hour, he'd observed 3 other arrests that raised serious red flags. A young Hispanic man brought in for resisting arrest who showed no signs of a struggle. A black woman charged with public intoxication who appeared completely sober. A teenage African-American boy arrested for loitering in what appeared to be his own neighborhood. All 3 arrests followed the same pattern Bennett had just experienced: minor traffic infractions or behavioral accusations that escalated quickly to serious charges. All 3 suspects maintained their innocence with a conviction that suggested they were telling the truth. And all 3 arrests had been made by Officer Dale Thompson's partner, Officer Kevin Walsh. Bennett was beginning to see the scope of the corruption. This wasn't just one rogue cop planting evidence. This was a systematic operation designed to generate arrests, collect bonuses, and line officers' pockets at the expense of innocent people's lives. Meanwhile, Thompson was in the report-writing room, crafting the lies that would send an innocent man to prison. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced ease, creating a narrative that painted Bennett as a dangerous drug dealer who had been acting suspiciously from the moment of the traffic stop. Subject appeared nervous and evasive when questioned about his presence in the area, Thompson typed, knowing that Bennett had been anything but nervous. When asked about the contents of his vehicle, subject's demeanor became increasingly agitated, suggesting consciousness of guilt. Thompson paused, thinking about how to describe the consent he'd never actually received for the vehicle search. This was always the trickiest part of his false reports, making illegal searches sound legitimate. He'd learned over the months that the key was in the details. The more specific his lies, the more believable they seemed to judges and prosecutors. Subject voluntarily consented to vehicle search after being informed of his rights, Thompson continued typing. During the course of the search, a plastic bag containing approximately 3.2 grams of what appeared to be cocaine was discovered concealed behind the spare tire in the vehicle's trunk. Subject immediately became hostile and accused this officer of planting evidence, a common deflection tactic used by drug offenders. Thompson smiled as he read over his work. The report was a masterpiece of fiction, detailed enough to seem credible, but vague enough to avoid contradicting any potential witness testimony. He'd used variations of this same report template for 12 other arrests this year, and it had worked perfectly every time. 37 minutes after Bennett's phone call, a tall man in an expensive suit walked through the front doors of the Millbrook County Police Department. He carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of dealing with law enforcement, and his credentials identified him as Robert Chen, attorney at law. "I'm here to see my client, James Bennett," Chen announced to the desk sergeant. "I understand he was arrested approximately an hour ago." The desk sergeant, Officer Patricia Williams, looked up from her computer screen. "Are you his lawyer?" "I am," Chen replied, producing his Bar Association card and identification. "I'll need to speak with him immediately, and I'll also need to review all arrest documentation and evidence." Officer Williams nodded and began the routine process of arranging the attorney visit. What she didn't know was that Robert Chen wasn't actually a lawyer. He was Deputy Director Robert Chen of the FBI's Internal Investigations Division, and he'd just driven 90 miles per hour from the regional office to get to this small-town police station. Chen had been James Bennett's deputy for 3 years, and they'd worked together on dozens of federal investigations into police corruption. When Bennett's call came in requesting Protocol 7, The FBI's code for a federal law enforcement officer in immediate danger, Chen had mobilized a response team that was already en route to Millbrook County. But Chen's immediate mission was intelligence gathering. He needed to assess the situation, identify all the players involved, and determine exactly how deep this corruption went before federal agents descended on the police station in force. "I'll also need to speak with the arresting officer," Chen told Officer Williams. "Standard procedure for reviewing the circumstances of my client's arrest." Williams picked up her phone to call Thompson, not knowing she was facilitating the beginning of a federal investigation that would ultimately destroy the careers of half the officers in the building. When Thompson arrived in the interview room, he was confident and relaxed. In his experience, defense attorneys were either overworked public defenders who barely had time to read case files, or expensive private lawyers who advised their clients to plead guilty to avoid trial. Either way, Thompson had learned to view defense attorneys as minor obstacles rather than serious threats. "Officer Thompson," Chen said, extending his hand with a professional smile. "Robert Chen, representing Mr. Bennett. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me." Thompson shook hands, already planning how he would handle this conversation. "Just doing my job, counselor. Your client was caught red-handed with a substantial amount of cocaine. Pretty straightforward case." Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad, but Thompson didn't notice that the pen Chen was using contained a digital recording device. "I'm sure it is, officer, but I need to understand the exact circumstances of the arrest for my client's defense. Can you walk me through the traffic stop from the beginning?" As Thompson began recounting his fabricated version of events, Chen listened with the trained ear of someone who'd investigated hundreds of police corruption cases. Every detail Thompson provided was being compared against federal standards for constitutional policing, and nearly every detail was failing that comparison. "So you observed my client speeding?" Chen asked, making notes. "That's correct. Radar indicated 42 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And where exactly was your radar unit positioned during this observation?" Thompson paused. He hadn't actually used radar since Bennett hadn't been speeding, but he needed to maintain his story. "Standard position on Route 47, just past the Miller Road intersection." Chen made another note. What Thompson didn't know was that Chen had already reviewed the county's radar calibration records, which showed that the unit Thompson claimed to have used had been out of service for maintenance for the past 2 weeks. "Tell me about the vehicle search," Chen continued. "How did you obtain consent?" Thompson launched into his rehearsed explanation about Bennett's nervous behavior and voluntary consent, not realizing that every word he spoke was being recorded and would soon be compared against any security footage that might exist of the traffic stop. "You mentioned that Mr. Bennett became agitated when you found the drugs," Chen said. "Can you describe his exact reaction?" "He immediately claimed I planted the evidence," Thompson replied. "Classic drug dealer behavior. Blame the cop when you get caught." Chen looked up from his notes, and Thompson caught something in his expression that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Have you encountered this type of false accusation before in your career, Officer Thompson?" "Sure," Thompson said, trying to sound casual. "Drug dealers always claim they're innocent. Part of the job. How many times would you estimate you've been accused of planting evidence?" Thompson's discomfort grew. This wasn't the kind of question defense attorneys usually asked. Most of them focused on procedural issues or tried to find technical grounds for dismissing charges. This line of questioning felt more like an internal affairs investigation than a defense strategy. "I don't keep count," Thompson replied. "But like I said, it's a common accusation from people who get caught breaking the law." Chen nodded and made another note. "I see. And in all these cases where suspects accused you of planting evidence, how many of those accusations were investigated by your department?" Now Thompson was definitely uncomfortable. "Look, counselor, I'm not sure what you're getting at, but I've been cleared in every complaint ever filed against me. My record speaks for itself." What Thompson didn't know was that Chen had already requested Thompson's complete personnel file from FBI databases, and the pattern of complaints was exactly what he'd expected to find. 12 complaints of evidence tampering in the past year, all involving minority suspects, all dismissed by Chief Rodriguez without serious investigation. While Chen was interviewing Thompson, other pieces of the investigation were falling into place. Back at FBI headquarters, a team of analysts was already deep diving into Thompson's arrest records, financial history, and known associates. What they were finding was painting a picture of corruption that was both broader and more systematic than anyone had initially suspected. Agent Lisa Murphy, the FBI's lead specialist in police corruption cases, was reviewing Thompson's arrest statistics when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, Thompson's drug arrest numbers had increased by 400%, but his cases had a conviction rate of only 60%, unusually low for drug possession charges. More disturbing was the demographic breakdown of Thompson's arrests. 93% of his drug arrests involved minorities, despite the fact that Millbrook County's population was only 35% non-white. The statistical probability of this happening by chance was essentially zero. Chen, Murphy said into her phone, calling the deputy director who was still interviewing Thompson. You need to know that we're looking at something much bigger than one planted evidence case. I'm seeing patterns that suggest systematic targeting of minority populations for false arrests. Chen listened to Murphy's preliminary findings while maintaining his professional demeanor with Thompson. Understood, he said carefully. Continue the analysis and keep me updated. Back at the police station, Thompson was becoming increasingly agitated by Chen's questions. The lawyer seemed to know an unusual amount about police procedures, evidence handling, and departmental policies. Most defense attorneys Thompson had dealt with barely understood the basics of criminal law, but Chen was asking questions that suggested deep familiarity with law enforcement operations. I'll also need to review any security footage of the traffic stop, Chen said casually. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. Security footage? Standard practice, Chen replied. Most police vehicles are equipped with dashboard cameras, and many intersections have traffic monitoring systems. I assume your department follows standard protocols for preserving video evidence? Thompson's mind raced. There was no dashboard camera footage because he deliberately disabled his unit's courting system before conducting the traffic stop. He'd learned months ago that video evidence made planting drugs much more difficult, so he developed the habit of claiming equipment malfunctions whenever he planned to frame someone. Unfortunately, our dashcam experienced a malfunction during the stop, Thompson said, trying to sound matter-of-fact about it. Technical difficulties happen sometimes with the older equipment. Chen made a note, but his expression suggested he found this explanation less than satisfactory. I see, and I suppose there's no way to recover the footage from the malfunctioned system? Afraid not, Thompson replied. When those units fail, the data is usually corrupted beyond recovery. What Thompson didn't know was that the FBI's technical analysis team was already en route to examine his patrol car's recording system. Federal investigators had ways of recovering corrupted data that Thompson couldn't imagine, and his deliberate sabotage of the recording equipment would soon become evidence of his consciousness of guilt. Meanwhile, other officers in the station were beginning to notice irregularities in Thompson's arrest. Officer Sarah Kim, who'd been with the department for 6 years, was reviewing the booking paperwork when something caught her attention. Hey, Rodriguez, Kim called to the chief. Thompson's arrest report says the suspect consented to a vehicle search, but the Miranda waiver form shows he specifically requested an attorney before answering any questions. Those two things don't usually go together. Chief Rodriguez looked up from her desk, the unease she'd been feeling all day crystallizing into genuine concern. What do you mean? Well, if a suspect is smart enough to immediately request legal representation, he's probably not going to voluntarily consent to having his car searched. It's inconsistent behavior. Rodriguez pulled the file and reviewed the paperwork herself. Officer Kim was right. The documentation told a contradictory story. Either Thompson had made errors in his report, or something more troubling was happening. Pull Thompson's arrest files from the past 6 months, Rodriguez ordered. I want to review them for similar inconsistencies. As Officer Kim began compiling the requested files, she was unknowingly gathering evidence that would soon be used in a federal prosecution for civil rights violations. At exactly 4:47 p.m., Chief Rodriguez's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Chief Rodriguez, this is Deputy Attorney General Patricia Morrison calling from the Department of Justice. I understand you have James Bennett in custody. Rodriguez felt her blood pressure spike. Calls from the Department of Justice were never routine, and they certainly weren't the kind of calls that came in regarding typical drug arrests. Yes, ma'am. He was arrested approximately 2 hours ago on drug possession charges. Chief Rodriguez, I need you to listen to me very carefully. James Bennett is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Whatever circumstances led to his arrest, I need to know immediately if proper procedures were followed. The phone slipped in Rodriguez's suddenly sweaty palm. The FBI director? She just watched one of her officers arrest the head of federal law enforcement in the United States. The implications were staggering, and Rodriguez's mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. Ma'am, I was told this was a routine drug arrest. Officer Thompson reported finding cocaine in the suspect's vehicle during a consensual search. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Chief Rodriguez, I want you to secure all evidence related to this arrest immediately. No one touches anything without federal oversight. We'll have agents on scene within the hour. Rodriguez hung up the phone, her hands shaking. In 30 seconds, her entire world had changed. A routine drug arrest had just become a federal incident that could destroy her career, her department, and possibly land several of her officers in prison. But before she could process the full magnitude of the situation, Officer Thompson appeared in her doorway. Chief, I just got off the phone with one of my confidential informants, Thompson said, his voice carrying a conspiratorial tone. Word on the street is that Bennett character we arrested today is a major player. The CI says drug dealers are already making calls trying to get him released. Rodriguez stared at Thompson, trying to reconcile what he was telling her with what she'd just heard from the Deputy Attorney General. Either Thompson was completely delusional, or he was lying to cover up something much worse than a simple procedural error. Thompson, I just received a call from the Department of Justice. They're telling me a very different story about our suspect. Thompson's confident expression faltered slightly. What kind of different story? Before Rodriguez could answer, her phone rang again. This time, Thompson could hear both sides of the conversation because Rodriguez had inadvertently activated the speakerphone. This is Vincent Castellano, came a gravelly voice through the phone. I need to speak with Thompson immediately. Rodriguez looked at Thompson questioningly, but his face had gone pale. Vincent Castellano was the loan shark Thompson owed money to, and he was calling the police station directly. Thompson, you there? Castellano's voice continued. My boys tell me you made a big arrest today. High-value target with serious cash potential. We need to discuss how this affects your payment schedule. The blood drained from Rodriguez's face as she realized what she was hearing. Thompson wasn't just corrupt, he was working directly with criminals, using his badge to generate income for organized crime figures. Thompson lunged for the phone, but it was too late. Rodriguez had heard enough to understand that her officer wasn't fighting crime. He was facilitating it. Chief, I can explain, Thompson began, but Rodriguez held up her hand. Officer Thompson, you are suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon. But Thompson's troubles were just beginning. From his holding cell, James Bennett had heard every word of the phone conversation with Vincent Castellano. The FBI director now had direct evidence that Thompson wasn't just planting drugs, he was working as an agent for organized crime figures. As Thompson realized his world was collapsing around him, he made a decision that would seal his fate. Instead of coming clean and cooperating with the investigation, he decided to double down on his lies and try to destroy evidence of his crimes. He had no idea that FBI agents were already analyzing his phone records, his financial transactions, and his arrest patterns. The federal investigation into Thompson's corruption was now operating at full speed, and every lie he told was just adding years to his eventual prison sentence. What do you think happens when Thompson realizes he's not just dealing with local police anymore, but with the full power of the FBI? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because what's coming next will blow your mind. At 5:23 p.m., the first black SUV pulled into the parking lot of Millbrook County Police Department. Then came another, and another. Within 10 minutes, 6 federal vehicles had surrounded the small-town police station, their tinted windows and government plates creating an atmosphere of impending doom that every officer inside could feel in their bones. Officer Patricia Williams was the first to notice them. She'd been working the front desk for 12 years, and in all that time, she'd never seen federal agents arrive in force like this. Usually, when the FBI came to Millbrook, it was 1 or 2 agents investigating bank robberies or interstate crimes. This looked like a small army preparing for war. "Chief," Williams called out nervously, "you might want to look outside." Rodriguez glanced through her office window and felt her stomach drop. Federal agents were emerging from the SUVs, dressed in crisp suits and carrying equipment cases. These weren't local detectives or state investigators. These were federal law enforcement officers, and they were here for a reason that Rodriguez was beginning to understand with growing horror. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson was in the break room, completely oblivious to the federal storm gathering outside. He was counting the money Vincent Castellano had delivered an hour earlier, $500 for Bennett's arrest, plus a bonus payment for what Castellano's organization considered a high-value target. Thompson had no idea that the man he'd framed was about to bring down not just his career, but an entire network of corruption that stretched far beyond one small-town police department. 1,200, 1,300, 1,400. Thompson whispered to himself, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. With this payment, he was almost caught up on his gambling debts. A few more arrests like Bennett's, and he'd be free and clear of his obligations to some very dangerous people. Thompson folded the cash and slipped it into his wallet, already planning his next move. He'd identified 3 more potential targets during his patrol that morning. A young Hispanic man driving an older car, a black woman who'd been walking through a predominantly white neighborhood, and a teenager whose only crime was riding his bicycle while black. In Thompson's twisted mind, these were all potential revenue sources, human beings he could destroy for profit. But as Thompson sat there counting his blood money, Deputy Director Chen was in Chief Rodriguez's office, preparing to reveal the truth that would change everything. "Chief Rodriguez," Chen said, closing the interview room door behind him, "before we go any further, I need to show you something." Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather credential case. When he opened it, Rodriguez found herself staring at an FBI badge and identification that read, "Deputy Director Robert Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Internal Investigations Division." "I'm not a defense attorney," Chen continued. "I'm Deputy FBI Director, and the man you have in custody is James Bennett, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Rodriguez felt the room spin around her. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her department had arrested the head of federal law enforcement in the United States. If Thompson's arrest was legitimate, it would be the biggest corruption case in FBI history. If it wasn't legitimate, it would be the end of her career and possibly her freedom. Director Bennett called in Protocol 7, Chen explained. "That's our code for a federal law enforcement officer in immediate danger. We've mobilized a full response team to investigate not just this arrest, but your entire department's practices over the past year." Through the window, Rodriguez could see more federal agents entering the building. They moved with the kind of purpose that suggested this wasn't a routine inquiry. This was a full-scale federal investigation, and Rodriguez was beginning to understand that her department was about to be torn apart piece by piece. "Deputy Director Chen," Rodriguez said, her voice barely steady, "I need you to understand that I had no knowledge of any impropriety in this arrest. Officer Thompson presented this as a routine drug possession case." Chen nodded sympathetically. "Chief, I believe you. But we have evidence suggesting that this wasn't an isolated incident. We need to review every arrest Thompson has made in the past 12 months, and we need to do it immediately. As Chen spoke, Rodriguez's mind raced through the implications. If Thompson had been planting evidence on other suspects, her entire department could be facing federal civil rights violations. Officers could go to prison. She could go to prison. The department might be dissolved entirely and placed under federal oversight. But the worst part was the human cost. If Thompson had been framing innocent people, how many lives had been destroyed? How many people were sitting in jail cells right now because of Thompson's lies? In the main bullpen, federal agents were setting up a command center with the efficiency of a military operation. Agent Murphy had arrived with 3 specialists in police corruption cases, and they were already requesting files, computer access, and evidence storage records. We need every arrest report Thompson has filed in the past year, Murphy told Officer Kim. We also need his personnel file, any complaint records, and all evidence logs for his cases. Officer Kim glanced nervously toward the break room where Thompson was still hiding, counting his money. Should I tell Officer Thompson that federal agents are here? Not yet, Murphy replied. We want to secure all evidence before he has a chance to destroy anything. As federal agents began their systematic review of Thompson's cases, a horrifying pattern emerged. David Kim's restaurant assault case. The arrest report described him as belligerent and uncooperative, but the booking photo showed no signs of a struggle. Angela Williams's public intoxication charge. Thompson claimed she was stumbling and incoherent, but the medical examination showed no alcohol or drugs in her system. Carlos Mendez's drug possession case was particularly damning. Thompson's report described finding methamphetamine in Carlos's backpack during a consensual search, but the timeline showed Thompson had access to Carlos's backpack for 4 minutes before discovering the drugs. 4 minutes was more than enough time to plant evidence. Chief Rodriguez, Agent Murphy called out. We need to speak with you immediately. Rodriguez approached the Federal Command Center with the dread of someone walking to their own execution. The evidence spread across the table told a story of systematic corruption that was worse than she'd ever imagined. We've identified at least 12 cases where Thompson's arrest reports contain significant inconsistencies, Murphy explained. But the pattern suggests there may be many more victims. Rodriguez looked at the files spread across the table, each one representing a life that Thompson had destroyed for money. Young people, working families, students, all targeted because Thompson thought they would be easy victims who wouldn't be believed when they claimed their innocence. There's something else, Murphy continued. We've been monitoring Thompson's phone calls since Director Bennett was arrested. He's been in contact with Vincent Castellano, a known associate of organized crime families. We have recorded conversations where they discuss payment for arrests. The room fell silent as the full scope of Thompson's crimes became clear. This wasn't just evidence tampering or police misconduct. This was conspiracy with organized crime, racketeering, and civil rights violations on a massive scale. But Thompson was still in the break room, completely unaware that his world was collapsing around him. He'd finished counting his money and was now reviewing his patrol schedule for the next day, planning which neighborhoods to target for his next round of false arrests. When Thompson finally emerged from the break room, he walked directly into what looked like a scene from a federal crime drama. FBI agents were everywhere, examining files, photographing evidence, and conducting interviews with other officers. The entire police station had been transformed into a federal crime scene. What the hell is going on here? Thompson demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who still believed he was in control of the situation. Agent Murphy looked up from the files she was reviewing. Officer Thompson, I'm Special Agent Murphy with the FBI. We need to speak with you about some of your recent arrests. Thompson's confidence wavered slightly, but his arrogance kept him from understanding the true gravity of his situation. Look, if this is about that Bennett character, I arrested him fair and square. Found drugs in his car during a legal search. Everything was by the book. Murphy exchanged glances with Deputy Director Chen, who had just emerged from his conversation with Chief Rodriguez. Thompson's casual dismissal of that Bennett character showed just how completely he'd misunderstood who he was dealing with. "Officer Thompson," Chen said, stepping forward, "the man you arrested is James Bennett, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The color drained from Thompson's face as the words hit him like a physical blow. The FBI director. He'd planted drugs on the head of federal law enforcement in the United States. His legs felt weak, and he had to grab onto a nearby desk to keep from falling. That's impossible," Thompson stammered. "He's just some drug dealer from the city. I ran his plates, I checked his record." "You checked the record of a federal law enforcement officer," Chen replied coldly. "And then you planted evidence on him. We have witnesses, we have physical evidence, and we have recorded phone conversations between you and Vincent Castellano discussing payment for arrests." Thompson's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. The loan sharks, the planted evidence, the false arrests, it was all coming apart at once. But instead of accepting responsibility or trying to cooperate, Thompson's desperation drove him to double down on his lies. "I didn't plant anything," Thompson said, his voice rising with panic. "Bennett looked guilty. He was acting suspicious. He consented to the search. I did my job exactly like I'm supposed to." Agent Murphy pulled out a recording device and placed it on the desk between them. "Officer Thompson, this is a recording of your phone conversation with Vincent Castellano from 2 hours ago. Would you like to hear it?" Thompson's face went white as his own voice filled the room. "Yeah, Vincent. I got your boy. High-value target, just like you said. Rich black guy from the city, probably carrying serious cash. This one's worth the bonus you promised." The recording continued, but Thompson couldn't hear anything over the pounding of his own heart. His corruption, his racism, his conspiracy with organized crime, it was all documented, recorded, and about to be used against him in federal court. As federal agents continued their investigation, Thompson realized that his only chance was to somehow make this entire situation disappear. If he could get Bennett to accept a deal, maybe drop the charges in exchange for Bennett leaving town quietly, he might be able to convince the FBI that this was all a misunderstanding. It was a desperate plan born of panic and delusion, but Thompson was too far gone to see how hopeless his situation had become. "I want to speak with Bennett," Thompson announced to Agent Murphy. "Maybe we can work something out." Murphy stared at him in disbelief. "Officer Thompson, you want to negotiate with the director of the FBI?" "Look, maybe I made some mistakes in my report," Thompson said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone trying to bargain their way out of disaster. "Police work is complicated. Things happen fast. Maybe I got some details wrong. If Bennett is willing to let this slide, I'm sure we can all forget this ever happened." Chen and Murphy exchanged looks of amazement. Thompson was actually suggesting that the director of the FBI should ignore being framed for drug possession to save a corrupt cop's career. "Officer Thompson," Chen said slowly, "you're asking the head of federal law enforcement to participate in a cover-up of your crimes." But Thompson was beyond rational thought now. The gambling debts, the loan sharks, the federal investigation, it was all closing in on him at once, and his mind was grasping for any possible escape. "Just let me talk to him," Thompson pleaded. "I'll explain that this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe offer to drop the charges if he agrees not to pursue this any further." Against their better judgment, federal agents allowed Thompson to approach Bennett's holding cell. What happened next would be the final nail in Thompson's coffin. "Bennett," Thompson called out as he approached the cell, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Maybe we can work something out." James Bennett looked up from where he'd been sitting quietly on the metal bench. For the first time since his arrest, he smiled. "Officer Thompson," Bennett said in a voice that carried quiet authority, "I think you should call your union representative." Thompson stared at Bennett, finally understanding that the man he'd tried to frame wasn't just any federal law enforcement officer. This was someone who'd spent decades fighting corruption, someone who'd built his entire career on putting people exactly like Thompson in prison. "You don't understand," Thompson said desperately. "I can make this all go away. Drop the charges, expunge your record, like none of this ever happened." Bennett stood up slowly, his dignity intact, despite the orange jumpsuit he'd been forced to wear. Officer Thompson, in approximately 10 minutes, you're going to be arrested for conspiracy, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and racketeering. The only thing you should be thinking about right now is whether you want to cooperate with the federal investigation or spend the next 20 years in prison wondering what might have been. Thompson backed away from the cell, but finally understanding that there was no escape, no deal, no way out of the disaster he'd created. The FBI director wasn't just another victim he could intimidate or manipulate. Bennett was the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country, and Thompson had just declared war on the entire federal justice system. As Thompson stumbled away from the holding cell, he could hear federal agents calling his name. His arrest was imminent, his career was over, and his life as he knew it was about to end. The corrupt cop who thought he could frame anyone with impunity was about to learn what justice looked like when it came from the very top of American law enforcement. Agent Murphy approached Officer Thompson with a folder thick enough to end a career. Inside were photographs, financial records, phone transcripts, and witness statements that painted a picture of corruption so systematic and brazen that even seasoned federal investigators were shocked by its scope. "Officer Dale Thompson," Murphy announced, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, evidence tampering, racketeering, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances." Thompson's legs gave out. He collapsed into a nearby chair, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Everything he'd built over 12 years as a police officer was crashing down around him in a matter of hours. The gambling debts that had driven him to corruption suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the federal prison sentence he was now facing. "This is impossible," Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked like what, Thompson?" Deputy Director Chen asked, stepping forward. "He looked like someone you could frame because of the color of his skin? Someone you thought society would write off as expendable?" Chen opened his own folder, revealing photographs that made Thompson's blood run cold. Pictures of Carlos Mendez in his college graduation cap, Angela Williams in her nursing uniform, smiling with her 2 young children, David Kim standing proudly in front of his family's restaurant. All the lives Thompson had destroyed for money, all the futures he'd stolen to pay gambling debts. "James Bennett," Chen continued, "is not just the director of the FBI. He's a man who grew up 15 miles from here, who worked his way through law school while his mother cleaned offices at night to pay for his books. He's someone who dedicated his entire life to fighting corruption exactly like yours." Thompson stared at the photographs of his victims, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd done. These weren't just arrest statistics or bonus payments. These were human beings whose lives he'd shattered for his own gain. Carlos had lost his scholarship and spent 6 months in jail. Angela had lost her nursing license and nearly lost custody of her children. David's family restaurant had closed, destroying 3 generations of work. But the revelation that was about to break Thompson completely was still coming. Chen pulled out one final photograph and placed it in front of Thompson. It was a picture of a 17-year-old James Bennett in handcuffs, being arrested by a white police officer 37 years ago. That officer's name was Frank Morrison, Chen explained. He planted evidence on teenage James Bennett in 1987, right here in Millbrook County. Morrison thought he could destroy a young black man's future and get away with it. Instead, that injustice forged Bennett into the man who would eventually become director of the FBI. Thompson's hands trembled as he looked at the photograph. The boy in handcuffs had grown up to become the most powerful law enforcement officer in America, and Thompson had just repeated the exact same crime that had shaped Bennett's entire career. "You didn't just plant drugs on some random suspect," Chen continued. "You planted evidence on someone who spent 4 decades fighting police corruption. Someone who's made it his life's mission to put officers like you in prison." The irony was so profound it was almost poetic. Thompson had chosen to frame the one person in America most equipped to destroy him for it. As federal agents continued their investigation, something remarkable began happening. Word spread through the community that Officer Thompson's arrests were being reviewed, and victims started coming forward. People who had been too afraid or too defeated to speak up were suddenly finding their voices. Carlos Mendez was the first to arrive at the police station. Now 20 years old, he'd spent the past year working double shifts at a warehouse to pay off legal fees from his false arrest. When he walked into the station and saw federal agents reviewing his case file, tears streamed down his face. "I told everyone I was innocent," Carlos said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Nobody believed me. They said I was just another drug dealer making excuses. But I was telling the truth. I never touched drugs in my life." Agent Murphy looked up from Carlos's file, her expression grim. "Mr. Mendez, we believe you. And we're going to make sure everyone knows you were telling the truth." Angela Williams arrived an hour later, still wearing her hospital scrubs from her new job as a medical assistant, the only position she could find after losing her nursing license. She'd brought her 2 children with her, 8-year-old Marcus and 6-year-old Destiny, because she couldn't afford a babysitter. "When Officer Thompson arrested me," Angela told Agent Murphy, "my kids were in the car. They watched their mother get handcuffed and taken to jail. Marcus still has nightmares about police officers. Destiny won't even look at a police car without crying." The human cost of Thompson's corruption was becoming clear. This wasn't just about false arrests or planted evidence. This was about children who'd lost trust in authority, families torn apart by lies, and young people whose futures had been stolen by a corrupt cop's greed. David Kim's story was perhaps the most heartbreaking. His family's restaurant had been in business for 30 years, serving the Millbrook community with pride and dignity. When Thompson arrested David and seized $3,000 as drug proceeds, the restaurant couldn't meet its expenses. Within 2 months, Kim's kitchen was closed forever. "My father built that restaurant with his bare hands," David said, his voice heavy with loss. "He came to America with nothing. Worked 18-hour days for 3 decades to build something for his family. Officer Thompson destroyed it all in one afternoon." As each victim told their story, a pattern of deliberate targeting became clear. Thompson hadn't chosen his victims randomly. He'd specifically selected people he thought would be easy to frame: minorities, immigrants, young people without resources to fight back. His corruption wasn't just criminal. It was systematic racism weaponized for profit. While Thompson sat in stunned silence, federal agents were unraveling the entire criminal network he'd been part of. The investigation had expanded far beyond one corrupt cop to encompass a conspiracy that reached into organized crime, drug trafficking, and municipal corruption. Vincent Castellano, the loan shark who'd been paying Thompson for arrests, found himself surrounded by federal agents at his social club in the next county. The raid uncovered records showing payments to 3 other police officers in neighboring jurisdictions, all involved in similar evidence-planting schemes. "This is bigger than we initially thought," Agent Murphy told Deputy Director Chen. "Thompson wasn't just a lone corrupt cop. He was part of an organized criminal enterprise that was manufacturing drug arrests to justify federal funding and generate revenue for criminal organizations." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Federal investigators discovered that Thompson's evidence-planting operation had generated over 50 false arrests in the past year, resulting in hundreds of thousands of dollars in seized assets, federal grants, and payments from criminal organizations. The human cost was immeasurable. Dozens of innocent people imprisoned, families destroyed, communities terrorized by corrupt law enforcement. But the investigation also revealed something that gave federal agents hope. Not every officer in the Millbrook County Police Department was corrupt. Officers like Sarah Kim and Patricia Blugiashim had been documenting irregularities in Thompson's cases for months, creating a paper trail that helped federal investigators identify victims and build cases. "There are good cops here," Chen told Agent Murphy. "Officers who've been trying to do the right thing in a system that was protecting corruption. They're going to be essential to rebuilding trust in this community." At 7:43 p.m., exactly 4 hours and 16 minutes after he'd arrested James Bennett, Officer Dale Thompson was led away in handcuffs. The same handcuffs he'd used to arrest an innocent man were now restraining his own wrists as federal agents read him his rights. Dale Thompson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, evidence tampering, racketeering, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. You have the right to remain silent. Thompson's arrest was broadcast live on local news stations, watched by every person whose life he'd destroyed over the past year. Carlos Mendez watched from his apartment, finally seeing justice for the false arrest that had derailed his education. Angela Williams watched with her children, explaining that sometimes bad people who wear badges get punished, just like anyone else who breaks the law. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Thompson was being arrested for the exact same crimes he'd falsely accused others of committing. The evidence he'd planted on innocent people was now being used as proof of his own guilt. Chief Rodriguez, meanwhile, was facing her own reckoning. While federal investigators had determined she wasn't personally involved in Thompson's corruption, her failure to properly investigate complaints against him had enabled his crimes to continue. Effective immediately, Rodriguez announced at a hastily called press conference, the Millbrook County Police Department is implementing comprehensive reforms in cooperation with federal oversight. Every arrest made by Officer Thompson will be reviewed. Every piece of evidence he handled will be re-examined. And every victim of his crimes will receive a full apology and assistance in clearing their records. The reforms Rodriguez announced were sweeping. Body cameras would be mandatory for all officers. Dashboard camera footage would be automatically uploaded to federal servers, preventing tampering. All drug arrests would require corroboration from a second officer. And civilian oversight would be expanded to include community representatives with real authority to investigate misconduct. While Thompson was being processed at the federal detention center, law enforcement agencies across 3 counties were conducting coordinated raids on the criminal network he'd been working with. Vincent Castellano was arrested at his social club. His associates were rounded up at various locations throughout the region. Even the drug dealers who'd been paying Thompson for planted evidence arrests found themselves facing federal charges. The operation, dubbed Clean Sweep by federal investigators, resulted in 23 arrests and the seizure of over $2 million in criminal proceeds. More importantly, it dismantled a corruption network that had been operating for years, destroying lives and undermining public trust in law enforcement. This investigation shows what happens when federal law enforcement takes police corruption seriously, Deputy Director Chen told reporters. No badge is a license to violate civil rights. No uniform grants immunity from justice, and no corruption network is too entrenched to be dismantled by determined federal action. Before leaving Millbrook County, James Bennett made one final visit to the police station where he'd been held in handcuffs just hours earlier. This time, he walked through the front door as the director of the FBI, flanked by federal agents, and greeted with the respect his position commanded. Bennett's first stop was the holding cell, where he'd spent 4 hours planning the downfall of Officer Thompson's corruption network. Standing in that same cell, now wearing his federal credentials instead of an orange jumpsuit, Bennett reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 37 years ago, he'd been a 17-year-old victim of police corruption in this same town. Today, he was the most powerful law enforcement officer in America, with the authority to ensure that what happened to him would never happen to anyone else. Director Bennett, Chief Rodriguez said as she approached the cell, "I want to personally apologize for what Officer Thompson did to you. There's no excuse for his actions and no justification for the failure of oversight that allowed his corruption to continue." Bennett nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Chief Rodriguez, apologies are important, but action is what matters. The question now is whether this department is committed to real reform or just managing a public relations crisis." Rodriguez had prepared for this moment, knowing that her response would determine the future of her department and her own career. "Director Bennett, we're requesting federal oversight of our operations for the next 2 years. We want FBI involvement in our training programs, our hiring practices, and our internal affairs investigations. We don't just want to avoid future corruption, we want to become a model for constitutional policing. It was a remarkable offer. A local police department voluntarily submitting to federal oversight in order to rebuild community trust. Bennett studied Rodriguez's face, looking for signs of sincerity or political calculation. "I'll hold you to that commitment," Bennett finally said, "and I'll be personally monitoring your progress." That evening, James Bennett stood before a packed auditorium at Millbrook Community College, addressing the town where he'd grown up and where he'd just experienced both injustice and redemption. The audience included many of Thompson's victims, community leaders, and citizens who'd lost faith in their local police department. 37 years ago, Bennett began, I was arrested in this town by a corrupt police officer who planted evidence on me because he thought a black teenager was an easy target. That injustice shaped my entire life, driving me to dedicate my career to fighting corruption in law enforcement. The audience listened in rapt attention as Bennett recounted his journey from teenage victim to FBI director, emphasizing how injustice had motivated him to seek justice for others. Today, history repeated itself when Officer Thompson attempted to frame me for drug possession. But this time was different. This time, I had the power to fight back. This time, the corrupt officer faced consequences for his actions. And this time, every victim of his crimes will see justice. Bennett's speech wasn't just about his own experience. It was a call to action for communities everywhere to demand accountability from their law enforcement agencies. Police corruption thrives in darkness, Bennett continued. It succeeds when communities are too afraid or too powerless to demand justice. But when citizens stand up, when good officers speak out, when federal law enforcement takes local corruption seriously, we can create the kind of justice system our Constitution promises. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Bennett wasn't finished. He had one more announcement that would reshape law enforcement in the region. Effective immediately, the FBI is establishing a permanent civil rights task force in this region, specifically focused on investigating police misconduct. Any citizen who believes they've been the victim of police corruption can contact this task force directly. Your complaints will be investigated by federal agents, not local authorities, who might have conflicts of interest. It was a revolutionary development. Federal law enforcement taking direct responsibility for policing the police in communities where local oversight had failed. After his public address, Bennett made one final stop in Millbrook County. He drove to Sunset Manor Nursing Home, where his 82-year-old mother was fighting her battle with dementia. Today had been one of the most significant days of his career, and he needed to share it with the woman who'd made it all possible. Bennett found his mother in the common room, staring out a window at the setting sun. As he approached, he hoped for one of her rare moments of clarity, when the fog of dementia lifted and she remembered who he was. "Mom," Bennett said softly, sitting beside her chair, "it's James, your son." His mother turned toward him, her eyes showing a flicker of recognition. "James? My James who became a lawyer?" Bennett's eyes filled with tears. She remembered. On this day of all days, she remembered. "Yes, Mom, you're James who became a lawyer, and today, I got justice for something that happened a long time ago. Remember when I was arrested as a teenager? When that police officer lied about me?" His mother's expression grew more focused, as if the memory was pulling her back from the darkness of her condition. "That officer hurt my boy, said you were a criminal when you were the best boy in the world. Today, Mom, another officer tried to do the same thing to me. But this time, I was strong enough to fight back. This time, justice won." Bennett's mother reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I'm proud of you, James. I always knew you'd fight for what's right." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set over Millbrook County, a town that had been the site of both Bennett's greatest injustice and his most significant victory. The final message. As Bennett drove away from the nursing home, his phone buzzed with updates from the ongoing investigation. Thompson had been denied bail and was facing a federal indictment that could result in a 25-year prison sentence. The other officers in his corruption network were being arrested throughout the region. And most importantly, all of Thompson's victims were being contacted by federal agents who would help them clear their records and seek compensation for the injustices they'd suffered. The story of Officer Thompson's downfall became national news, a cautionary tale about how corruption can flourish when oversight fails and how quickly justice can be served when the right person refuses to be victimized. But the real lesson wasn't about one corrupt cop or one FBI director. It was about the power of integrity in the face of injustice, the importance of never giving up the fight for what's right, and the truth that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, is above the law. Thompson had thought he could frame anyone with impunity. He'd chosen his victims based on racist assumptions about who would be believed and who would be dismissed. He'd turned his badge into a weapon against the innocent and his uniform into a disguise for criminal behavior. But in trying to frame James Bennett, Thompson had made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd targeted someone who'd dedicated 40 years to fighting exactly the kind of corruption Thompson represented. He'd attacked someone with the power, knowledge, and determination to bring down entire criminal networks. Most importantly, Thompson had reminded America why we need law enforcement officers who see their badge as a sacred trust, not a license for abuse. Why we need communities that demand accountability from those who serve them. And why we need federal oversight to ensure that justice isn't just a word, but a promise kept to every citizen, regardless of their race, their background, or their circumstances. If this story shows you why police accountability matters, and why we must never stop fighting for justice, hit that subscribe button and be part of Mirror Stories channel family, and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in James Bennett's situation, and how do you think we can prevent corruption like this from happening in your community? Officer Dale Thompson thought he could destroy an innocent man's life for $500. Instead, he discovered that justice has a way of finding even the most corrupt among us, and that sometimes the person you try to frame has the power to frame you right back. Not with lies and planted evidence, but with the truth and the full weight of American justice. In the end, corruption didn't pay. Justice did.